Officer David Miller was nearing the end of his shift on a cool Thursday evening. The sun had just set over the small town of Riverdale, casting long shadows across the empty highway. After 12 years on the force, most traffic stops blended together in his memory. This one would be different. Miller adjusted his hat and sipped the last of his lukewarm coffee. His radio crackled occasionally with routine updates from dispatch. Nothing serious had happened in Riverdale for weeks. The town of 15,000 people rarely saw major crimes, which suited Miller just fine. As he pulled onto Route 27, he noticed a black van ahead. The vehicle moved slightly over the center line, then corrected itself. Miller watched for another minute. The van did it again, drifting between lanes in a way that suggested the driver might be tired or impaired. Possible DUI on Route 27, Miller said into his radio. He provided the license plate number and turned on his lights. The van didn't stop immediately. It continued for another quarter-mile before finally pulling to the shoulder. This raised Miller's suspicions further. He approached cautiously, one hand resting near his holster as he'd been trained to do. Through the driver's window, Miller saw a heavy-set man in his 40s with thinning hair and a wrinkled button-up shirt. The man smiled, but his eyes darted nervously around. "License and registration, please," Miller said, shining his flashlight inside the vehicle. "Sure thing, officer," the driver replied. His hands trembled as he reached for the glove compartment. "Just going a little fast, was I?" "You were weaving between lanes," Miller explained. "Have you had anything to drink tonight, sir?" No, just tired. Been driving since morning." The man handed over his documents. His name was Robert Carson from a city about 300 miles away. Miller studied the license. Something felt off. The photo matched, but Carson's story didn't add up. The registration showed the van belonged to a rental company. "Where are you headed tonight, Mr. Carson?" Miller asked. "Just passing through, delivering some furniture to my sister." Carson's eyes wouldn't meet Miller's. Miller noticed a bead of sweat rolling down Carson's temple despite the cool evening. "Would you step out of the vehicle, please?" Carson hesitated. "Is that really necessary, officer? I'm already running late." "It won't take long. Please step out." Miller kept his tone firm but polite. As Carson reluctantly opened the door, Miller caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A small hand quickly pulled back from the partition separating the front seats from the cargo area. Miller felt his heart rate increase. "Sir, is there someone else in this vehicle?" "No, it's just me," Carson said too quickly. "I need to check the back of the van," Miller stated, no longer asking permission. "You can't do that without a warrant." Carson's voice rose in pitch. Miller's training kicked in. "Sir, I saw movement in the back. That gives me reasonable cause." Carson suddenly lunged toward Miller. The officer was quicker. He stepped back and drew his weapon. On the ground, now. With Carson secured in handcuffs, Miller cautiously approached the rear doors of the van, his hand paused on the handle. In 12 years of police work, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Right now, they were screaming that something was very wrong. Miller took a deep breath and pulled open the door. What he saw inside made the blood drain from his face. He immediately reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. I need immediate backup on Route 27, mile marker 42. Code 30. The back of the van revealed a sight that would haunt Officer Miller for years to come. 3 young women sat huddled together, their wrists bound with zip ties. Their fearful eyes squinted against the sudden brightness of Miller's flashlight. They wore dirty clothes and looked like they hadn't eaten properly in days. "It's okay. I'm a police officer. You're safe now," Miller said gently, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anger and shock surging through him. One of the women, barely more than a teenager with dark hair, began to cry silently. Another, slightly older with blonde hair, whispered something in a language Miller didn't understand. The third woman remained completely still, staring blankly ahead. Miller kept his gun trained on Carson while trying to reassure the women. He could hear sirens in the distance. Help was coming, but these few minutes felt endless. "You don't understand what you're getting into," Carson growled from his position on the ground. "This is bigger than you think." "Shut up," Miller ordered, fighting to control his rage. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." The first patrol car arrived within 4 minutes, followed quickly by 2 more. Officer Jenkins, Miller's longtime friend, was first on the scene. "My God," Jenkins whispered when Miller showed him the van's contents. "Get medical here now," Miller said, "and call Detective Ramirez. This is a trafficking case." The quiet country road transformed into a flurry of activity. Emergency lights painted the trees red and blue. Paramedics arrived and began checking the women. Miller watched as they were wrapped in blankets and led to the ambulances. Carson sat in the back of a patrol car, his face a mask of contempt rather than remorse. Miller couldn't bear to look at him. Detective Sarah Ramirez arrived 20 minutes later. Her dark eyes took in the scene with practiced efficiency. She had been working human trafficking cases for 8 years. "Good work, Miller," she said after he briefed her. "If you hadn't stopped this van." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "The driver had this in his pocket," Miller said, handing her a phone in an evidence bag. "And there's a GPS system in the van. Might show where they've been and where they were headed." Ramirez nodded. "We'll check all of it. This could be connected to other cases." Miller watched as the last of the women was helped into an ambulance. The youngest one caught his eye and mouthed what looked like "thank you" before the doors closed. "What happens to them now?" Miller asked. "We'll take their statements once they're medically cleared," Ramirez explained. "The language barrier might be an issue. I'm guessing they're not from around here. We'll need translators." Miller nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him hollow. "You should go home," Ramirez said, noticing his fatigue. "We got this covered. You've done the hard part." But Miller knew he couldn't leave yet. "I want to see this through, at least for tonight." Back at the station, Carson refused to speak without a lawyer. The phone found in his possession contained nothing immediately useful, no contacts, no messages. It was clearly a burner phone. Around midnight, Ramirez received a call that made her face light up with grim satisfaction. "The GPS history from the van," she told Miller. "It shows 5 different stops across 3 states in the past week. We're coordinating with those jurisdictions now." Miller realized this was just the beginning. What had started as a routine traffic stop was opening up into something much larger and darker. "Get some rest, Miller," Ramirez said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As Miller finally drove home in the early hours of the morning, he couldn't shake the image of those women's eyes. He had joined the police to make a difference. Today, he knew he had. Officer Miller arrived at the station early the next morning, despite having slept less than 4 hours. Dark circles framed his eyes, but determination kept him moving. The station buzzed with unusual activity. What began as a traffic stop had evolved into the biggest case Riverdale had seen in decades. Detective Ramirez was already there, standing before a bulletin board covered with maps, photos, and red string connecting various points. She nodded at Miller as he approached. "The women are at Riverdale Memorial," she said. "They're physically stable, but traumatized. We've identified them with help from a translator. All 3 are from Moldova. They were promised waitressing jobs in America." Miller shook his head. Had they said anything about how they ended up in Carson's van? Bits and pieces. They were passed between several handlers. Carson was just a transporter. Ramirez pointed to the map. "Based on the GPS data, we think there are more victims. Carson made stops in these 5 locations over the past week." The map showed a route spanning from New York through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and finally to their small corner of Illinois. "What about Carson? Still not talking?" Miller asked. "His lawyer showed up at dawn. Carson's keeping quiet, but we found something interesting." Ramirez handed Miller a folder. "His real name is Edward Mercer. He has priors for drug trafficking in Nevada and Arizona. This is a step up in his criminal career." Miller flipped through the file. "What's his connection to the trafficking ring?" "That's where it gets interesting. We found a business card in his wallet for a company called Elite Staffing Solutions. It matches information the women gave us about who recruited them overseas." The station door opened, and Chief Wilson strode in. His normally calm face looked troubled. "We've got FBI arriving in an hour," he announced. This case just got bigger. Similar vans have been spotted in 3 other states. Miller felt a strange mix of emotions. He was glad the case was getting attention, but a small part of him worried that once federal agents took over, he'd be pushed aside. Ramirez seemed to read his thoughts. Don't worry, Miller. You're staying on this. The Bureau specifically requested the officer who made the initial stop. Before Miller could respond, his phone rang. It was the hospital. Officer Miller, this is Nurse Jenkins from Riverdale Memorial. The youngest trafficking victim is asking for you. She says she has information she'll only share with the officer who saved them. 20 minutes later, Miller sat beside the hospital bed of the dark-haired girl. Her name was Elena, and she was just 19 years old. A translator sat nearby, but Elena insisted on trying to speak English. There are others, she said softly. Many more girls. I hear them talking when they think we sleep. Big house in the woods. Many girls there. Miller leaned forward. Do you know where this house is? Did you see anything that could help us find it? Elena closed her eyes, concentrating. Before the van, we were in another place. I saw water tower. Blue with name. Lakeview or Lakeside. Miller quickly texted this information to Ramirez. Within minutes, she responded. Lakeside Water Tower is in Chapman County, 50 miles north. One of the stops on Carson's GPS route. Elena grabbed Miller's hand suddenly. The man who bring us to America, he has a mark here. She pointed to her neck. Bird. Eagle maybe. A tattoo? Miller asked. Elena nodded. He is not Carson. He is bigger man. Important man. Carson afraid of him. Miller thanked Elena for her courage. As he left the hospital, Ramirez called. FBI's here. They want us in Chapman County now. SWAT team is assembling. Miller drove with a knot in his stomach. What had begun as a simple traffic stop was about to become a full-scale raid. Somewhere in the woods near a blue water tower were more women like Elena, waiting for someone to find them. And somewhere, a man with an eagle tattoo was about to have his operation blown wide open. The convoy of unmarked vehicles and SWAT vans moved silently through the winding roads of Chapman County. Officer Miller sat in the passenger seat of Detective Ramirez's car, studying a satellite map of the area surrounding the Lakeside Water Tower. The blue structure stood out against the dense forest, visible from miles away. 2 miles ahead, Ramirez said quietly, FBI wants us to park behind that ridge and approach on foot. Miller nodded, checking his vest again. This was far beyond his usual duties, but the FBI team leader had insisted on his presence. You built rapport with the victim, she had explained. The women might trust you more than strangers in tactical gear. The vehicles pulled over in a clearing hidden from the main road. Agent Daniels, the FBI team leader, gathered everyone for a final briefing. Thermal imaging confirms at least 15 people inside the property. Based on movement patterns, we believe 12 are potential victims and 3 are suspects. 2 vehicles are parked out front, a black SUV and a red pickup truck. Miller listened intently as Daniels outlined the rescue plan. SWAT would secure the perimeter while a smaller team entered the main house. Miller and Ramirez would follow with female agents to help manage the victims. Remember, these women are traumatized, Daniels concluded. They may not immediately recognize us as help. They may hide. They may run. Our priority is their safety. Questions? No one spoke. The gravity of the mission settled over the group. They moved through the forest with practiced precision. Within 20 minutes, the property came into view, a large, isolated house with boarded windows and a high fence. It looked abandoned from a distance, but faint light flickered behind the boards. In position, crackled the radio. SWAT teams had surrounded the property. Miller's heart hammered in his chest. He thought of Elena in the hospital and the fear in her eyes. He thought of the other women, trapped just yards away from where he stood. Execute, Daniels ordered. The raid happened with controlled chaos. SWAT breached the front and back doors simultaneously. Shouts of FBI echoed through the trees. Miller heard a gunshot, then another. Despite his training to stay back, he found himself moving forward with Ramirez. Inside, the house was a maze of dirty rooms. SWAT officers cleared each space methodically. In the living room, a man lay face down, handcuffed. Another tried to flee through a window but was quickly subdued. Third suspect heading to the woods, someone shouted over the radio. Miller followed 2 SWAT officers toward the back of the house. They entered a dark hallway with several doors. From behind one, Miller heard whimpering. This is Officer Miller from Riverdale Police, he called out. We're here to help you. You're safe now. The whimpering stopped. After a moment of silence, a voice called back in broken English. Police? Real police? Yes, real police, Miller confirmed. We found Alina. She's safe at the hospital. She told us where to find you. The door slowly opened. Inside, women huddled together on bare mattresses. Their faces showed a mix of fear, hope, and disbelief. Miller recognized the same look he'd seen in the van, people who had given up hoping for rescue. It's over, he told them gently. You're free now. Outside, agents had captured the third suspect trying to escape through the woods. Miller walked over as they brought him to a vehicle. A man was tall with expensive clothes, now covered in dirt. As they pushed his head down to place him in the car, Miller caught sight of a tattoo on his neck, an eagle, just as Elena had described. Their eyes met briefly. The man with the eagle tattoo showed no remorse, only cold anger at being caught. Back at the house, paramedics tended to the women. Blankets were distributed. Names were recorded. 12 women from 4 different countries, all brought to America with false promises. As the sun began to set, Miller stood watching the operation wind down. A simple traffic stop had led to this moment. 12 lives saved, a trafficking ring disrupted. You did good, Miller, Ramirez said, joining him. But this isn't over yet. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Officer Miller barely saw his family as he shoveled between the station, the hospital, and the temporary housing where the rescued women now stayed. The case had drawn national attention, with news vans camped outside the Riverdale Police Department. Miller sat in the station's conference room, now converted into a command center for the joint FBI local police operation. Photos of suspects lined one wall, while victim statements covered another. At the center sat a large mugshot of Viktor Kravchenko, the man with the eagle tattoo. Kravchenko isn't talking, Agent Daniels said, sliding a coffee toward Miller. But his fingerprints match ones found in trafficking cases in 6 different states. Miller rubbed his tired eyes. What about the women? How are they doing? Better than expected, Ramirez answered, entering with a stack of files. Most have agreed to testify. Alana has been especially helpful. She remembered dates, locations, conversations she overheard. Miller nodded, thinking of the young Moldovan woman's quiet strength. He had visited her yesterday, bringing a small stuffed bear his daughter had insisted on giving the lady Dad helped. Alana had clutched it like a precious gift. We've identified 3 more properties connected to Kravchenko's operation, Daniels continued, pointing to a map. Raids are scheduled for tomorrow, but there's something bigger here. Kravchenko is mid-level at best. Someone's backing him with serious money. The conference room door opened, and Chief Wilson entered with a suited man Miller hadn't seen before. This is U.S. Attorney James Harlow, Wilson announced. He'll be leading the prosecution. Harlow shook hands around the room, his grip firm and confident. We're building the strongest case possible, but we need more. Bank records show Kravchenko receiving regular payments from shell companies, but we can't trace the source yet. Miller thought about the terror in the women's eyes when they were found. What can I do to help? Carson, or Mercer, whatever his name is, might be our best chance, Harlow said. He's facing life in prison. Maybe he'd consider a deal. I'll talk to him, Miller offered immediately. 2 hours later, Miller sat across from Edward Mercer in an interrogation room. The man looked smaller somehow, his arrogance deflated by days in custody. I'm not here to waste your time, Miller began. Kravchenko isn't talking, but we know he wasn't the boss. The U.S. attorney is prepared to offer you a deal if you give us the name at the top. Mercer stared at his handcuffed wrists. You don't understand what they'll do to me if I talk. I understand what will happen if you don't, Miller countered. 25 to life, no parole. I'd be dead in a week, Mercer whispered. These people have connections everywhere. Miller leaned forward. We can protect you. Witness protection, new identity, the works. Mercer laughed bitterly. Like you protected those girls? I was just a driver. I never hurt anybody. You saw what was happening and did nothing, Miller said, his voice hardening. That makes you part of it. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Finally, Mercer sighed deeply. There's a man. I never met him face to face. Kravchenko called him the director. Once a month, I deliver a package to a P.O. box in Chicago. Cash profits, I think. We need more than that, Miller pressed. Check Kravchenko's phone. There's an app that looks like a calculator. It's not. It's encrypted messaging. The password is Nighthawk37. That's how they communicate. Miller stood up. I'll tell the prosecutor you cooperated. As he reached the door, Mercer called after him, Officer Miller? Those girls in the van, are they okay? Miller paused. They will be. No thanks to you. Back in the command center, Miller shared what he'd learned. Agent Daniels immediately called tech support to examine Kravchenko's phone. If we can access their communications, we might identify the entire network, Ramirez said, hope rising in her voice. Miller nodded, feeling the weight of fatigue, but also the first real sense that justice might be possible. What had begun with a black van on a dark highway was expanding into something that could save countless lives. The encrypted messaging app on Kravchenko's phone became the key that unlocked the entire operation. FBI tech specialists worked through the night, decoding conversations that revealed a trafficking network spanning 3 continents. At the center of it all was a name, Alexander Petrov, a Russian businessman with legitimate interests in shipping and real estate. We've been tracking Petrov for years, Agent Daniels explained during the morning briefing. But we never had enough evidence to connect him directly to trafficking. Miller studied the photograph of Petrov on the screen, a well-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and cold eyes. He looked more like a CEO than a criminal mastermind. So what's our next move? Miller asked. Petrov is scheduled to attend a charity gala in Chicago this weekend, Daniels replied. It's the first time he's been on U.S. soil in 3 years. We'll move on him there. Ramirez shook her head. Won't he just claim diplomatic immunity or something? These types always have protection. Not this time, Harlow, the U.S. attorney, said firmly. The evidence from Kravchenko's phone gives us enough for an arrest warrant. Petrov enters that gala. He's not leaving as a free man. Miller found himself assigned to the operations support team. While FBI agents would make the actual arrest, local officers who had been involved from the beginning would help secure the perimeter and process evidence. 2 days later, Miller sat in a surveillance van outside the Grand Palmer Hotel in downtown Chicago. Through the monitors, he watched elegantly dressed guests arriving for the Children's Hospital Benefit Gala, an irony not lost on anyone in the van. Target approaching, a voice announced over the radio. Black Mercedes, East Entrance. Miller watched as a sleek car pulled up to the red carpet. Petrov emerged, handsome in a tuxedo, a much younger woman on his arm. He smiled for photographers, looking completely at ease. He has no idea, Ramirez whispered beside Miller. Move teams into position, Daniels ordered through the radio. Wait for my signal. Miller felt his heart racing as he watched Petrov mingle inside the ballroom. The man laughed and chatted, accepted a glass of champagne, completely unaware that his empire was about to crumble. After 20 minutes, Petrov excused himself and headed toward a private elevator, not part of the expected plan. He's moving, Daniels said urgently. All teams converge, now. Miller and Ramirez rushed from the van, following other officers through the hotel's service entrance. They reached the mezzanine level just as Petrov was stepping into a private elevator with 2 bodyguards. FBI, Alexander Petrov, you're under arrest, Daniels shouted, gun drawn. What happened next unfolded in seconds. One bodyguard reached inside his jacket. Shots were fired. Guests screamed and ducked for cover. Miller found himself tackling the second bodyguard as he tried to shield Petrov. When the chaos cleared, one bodyguard lay wounded on the marble floor. The other was in handcuffs, and Petrov stood with his hands raised, his face a mask of cold fury. You have no idea what you're doing, he said as Agent Daniels read him his rights. Alexander Petrov, you are under arrest for human trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As they led Petrov away, Miller noticed a young server watching from behind a column. Her hands trembled as she stared at Petrov. Something about her expression, fear mixed with hatred, caught Miller's attention. Excuse me, miss? Miller approached her gently. Are you all right? She flinched. I'm fine, she said in accented English. Did you know him? Miller asked, nodding toward where Petrov had been. The woman hesitated, then whispered, 3 years ago, I was in one of his houses. Before I escaped, she slipped away before Miller could respond. Outside, as Petrov was placed in an FBI vehicle, reporters swarmed the scene. Miller watched from the hotel steps, thinking about the server's words and all the women he'd helped rescue. For each one saved, how many others remained unseen? His phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Is it true? Did you catch him? Yes, Miller typed back. It's over. But he knew that wasn't entirely true. One network dismantled, but how many others continued to operate in the shadows? 3 months passed since Alexander Petrov's arrest. The case had grown into the largest human trafficking prosecution in state history. Winter had melted into spring, and Officer Miller found himself sitting in a federal courthouse in Chicago, waiting to testify. The hallway bustled with lawyers, witnesses, and journalists covering the high-profile trial. Miller straightened his tie, feeling out of place in the formal setting. In Riverdale, he rarely needed anything more formal than his police uniform. Nervous? Detective Ramirez asked, taking a seat beside him. She had become a good friend through the ordeal of the investigation. A little, Miller admitted. I testified in court before, but nothing like this. Just tell the truth, exactly as it happened, she advised. Everything started with your traffic stop. You're the reason we're here today. Miller nodded, though he felt uncomfortable with the credit. He thought about how close he had come to ignoring the van's slight weaving that night. A simple decision to flick on its lights had unraveled an international criminal network. The courtroom doors opened, and a federal marshal appeared. Officer David Miller, they're ready for you. Inside the courtroom, Miller took the oath and settled into the witness stand. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen, approached with a confident smile. Officer Miller, please tell the court about the night of January 12th, when you first encountered the black van driven by Edward Mercer. Miller described the traffic stop in detail, the van's erratic movement, Mercer's nervous behavior, and the moment he discovered the women in the back. As he spoke, he avoided looking at Petrov, who sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his face expressionless. And what did you do upon discovering the victims? Chen asked. I called for backup immediately and secured the scene, Miller replied. My main concern was the safety of the women. The questioning continued for nearly an hour. Then came cross-examination. Petrov's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Greenberg, approached the stand. Officer Miller, in your 12 years on the force, how many traffic stops have you conducted? Hundreds, maybe thousands, Miller answered. And in these thousands of stops, how many times have you searched a vehicle without a warrant? Miller felt his face warm. Only when I had reasonable cause. So you regularly make judgment calls about what constitutes reasonable cause. Objection. Chen called out. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge ruled. Greenberg tried several times to suggest Miller had violated procedure, but Miller's answers remained steady. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, he felt drained but satisfied. Outside the courtroom, Miller found Elena waiting. She looked different now, healthier, more confident. She was working with an advocacy group helping other trafficking survivors while attending community college classes. You did well, she said with a small smile. I watched from the back. Tomorrow is your turn, Miller reminded her gently. Are you ready? Elena took a deep breath. I'm scared, but I will do it. For the others who cannot speak. That evening, Miller joined Ramirez and several FBI agents at a small restaurant near the courthouse. The mood was cautiously optimistic. Petrov's lawyer is good, Agent Daniels acknowledged, but our case is solid. The financial records alone connect him directly to every property where victims were held. What about the women? Miller asked. After the trial, what happens to them? Most will stay in the victim protection program, Ramirez explained. New identities, support for housing and education. It's not perfect, but it's a chance at a new life. Miller nodded, thinking of Elena and her courage. He thought of the 16 women rescued from Petrov's network and the dozens more identified in other countries. Their testimony had been recorded in private sessions, their faces blurred to protect their identities. As the group left the restaurant, Miller's phone buzzed with a message from his wife. Just saw you on the news. So proud of you. Come home safe. He smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for his normal, quiet life, something the victims had been denied for so long. Tomorrow, Elena would face her captor in court. Miller had promised to be there for support. The case wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he believed justice might actually be possible. 1 year had passed since the night Officer Miller pulled over the black van on Route 27. It was a warm summer evening as he parked his patrol car in front of the Riverdale Community Center. The building was decorated with colorful banners announcing the Survivor Support Network annual fundraiser. Miller adjusted his tie, feeling strange in formal clothes rather than his uniform. His wife Sarah squeezed his hand supportively as they walked inside. The lobby was filled with people chatting and examining silent auction items. Photographs lined one wall. Faces of survivors, their identities protected with careful lighting, yet their strength clearly visible. "Officer Miller," a familiar voice called out. Alana hurried toward them, looking transformed from the frightened girl he first met. Her hair was styled elegantly, and she wore a professional blue dress. She worked full-time now for the Survivor Network, using her experience to help others. "Elena, you look wonderful," Sarah said, giving her a warm hug. "Thank you for coming," Elena replied. "Both of you, tonight is special." Inside the main hall, tables were arranged around a small stage. Miller recognized many faces: Detective Ramirez, Agent Daniels, the prosecutor Chen, and others who had worked on the case. But most tables were filled with people he didn't know: supporters, donors, and advocates who had been moved by the story. After dinner, the center's director approached the microphone. "Tonight, we celebrate 1 year since the dismantling of the Petrov trafficking network. Because of the bravery of survivors and the dedication of law enforcement, 17 perpetrators are now serving prison sentences." Applause filled the room. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Alexander Petrov received a sentence of 60 years without parole. His assets have been seized and converted into a victim compensation fund that will help survivors rebuild their lives. More applause followed. Miller thought back to the trial's conclusion 6 months ago. Petrov had shown no remorse, even at sentencing. His empire had fallen, but Miller knew others would try to take his place. The director continued, "But tonight isn't just about those who are gone. It's about those who remain, those who survived and are building new lives. And it's about the everyday heroes who make those second chances possible." Elena approached the stage. She had told Miller she would be speaking briefly, but hadn't shared details. "1 year ago, I was in the back of a van, believing I would never see my family again," she began, her voice steady despite the difficult words. Then a police officer looked inside that van and everything changed. Miller felt his throat tighten as Elena continued. That officer could have simply written a ticket for bad driving. Instead, he trusted his instincts. Because of one person paying attention, 19 women from 5 countries are free today. Elena gestured toward Miller's table. Officer David Miller didn't know what he would find when he opened that van door, but he was ready to help when he did. Sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come from the smallest decisions others make. After Elena's speech, more survivors shared their stories, some in person, others through recorded video. Each story was different, yet connected by threads of courage and resilience. Near the end of the evening, the director presented Miller with a simple plaque. He accepted it awkwardly, uncomfortable with recognition but moved by the meaning behind it. Later, as the event wound down, Miller found himself standing next to Alana on the community center's porch. "What happens next for you?" he asked. She smiled. "I start university in the fall. Psychology. I want to help others heal." "You'll be good at that," Miller said sincerely. "And you?" Elena asked. "Will you stay a patrol officer?" Miller looked out at the peaceful town of Riverdale. "I've been offered a position with a new human trafficking task force, training other officers what to look for during routine stops." "You should take it," Elena said firmly. "More officers like you means more people like me get second chances." As Miller drove home that night, he thought about how a simple traffic stop had changed so many lives, including his own. He had become a police officer to make a difference, but had never expected it would happen quite like this. The black van was long gone now, but its impact remained. A reminder that sometimes the most important moments in life begin with simply paying attention to the small details that don't seem quite right.